The containment grid was screaming, not a slow warning pulse like the ones we ran in training drills, but a full, raw alarm, every light on the monitoring wall flashing gold at once, the floor vibrating beneath my feet as something deep inside the Kelvaran array shifted for the first time in recorded memory. I had worked in this vault for 62 years. I had never heard that sound before. I had never expected to hear it. And the only reason it was happening at all was because a 16-year-old human girl named Nora Callum had just pressed a sequence of inputs that no Voss scientist in 5,000 years had ever thought to try. She was not even supposed to be in the room. My name is Sen Duvrak, Senior Containment Researcher for the Voss Institute of Precursor Studies, and before that morning I would have told you, with complete confidence, that nothing in the universe surprised me anymore. I had seen too much, studied too long, watched too many brilliant minds pour themselves into the array only to walk away empty. I had learned, over 6 decades of careful, disciplined work, to manage my own hope the way you manage a fragile instrument, gently, never too hard, never too fast, because hope applied too recklessly to something as unforgiving as the Kelvaran array would eventually break you. The array was not a machine in any ordinary sense of the word. Even calling it a structure felt inadequate. It had been discovered 41 centuries before my birth, buried beneath the northern shelf of a dead planet at the edge of our explored space, intact and perfectly preserved inside a chamber sealed by methods our engineers still did not fully understand. It was roughly the size of a large building, composed of interlocking rings of dark, dense material that our instruments had never been able to fully classify, surrounding a central core of compressed energy that should not, by every law of physics my people understood, have remained stable for as long as it had. The civilization that built it had no name we could speak. They had been gone for so long that even the ruins of their ruins had turned to dust. All they had left behind was the array, and the array had left behind 5,000 years of Voss failure. Every generation of our scientists had approached it differently, and every generation had lost. The first researchers to study it believed it was a power source, and spent 2 centuries developing perfect resonance equations designed to draw energy from its core. The array absorbed every attempt without reaction. Later schools of thought believed it was a communication device, a beacon of some kind, and spent another era sending carefully structured signals into its central column. The array remained silent. More recent theories, the ones my own career had been built around, suggested it was a gateway, a portal of some kind, tied to the structure of space itself, requiring a specific geometric input to activate. We had spent 140 years developing and testing those inputs. The array had ignored every single one. 5,000 years, thousands of researchers, hundreds of competing theories, all of it ending in the same place, quiet, unmoved, unchanged, as though the greatest minds my civilization had ever produced were not even worth acknowledging. And then came the humans. The diplomatic exchange was not my idea, and I will admit freely that I was not pleased when I first received word of it. Our council had agreed, as part of an early friendship arrangement with the newly encountered human species, to host a small visiting delegation at our research station for a period of cultural observation. 2 diplomats, 1 junior aide, 1 interpreter, and, for reasons that were explained to me as logistical rather than intentional, 1 teenager who had no business being within 3 systems of a facility as sensitive as ours. Her name was Nora Callum. Her father, a calm and carefully spoken diplomat named George Callum, had brought her along because there had been no suitable arrangement for her back home during the length of the mission. She was 16, sharp-eyed, and visibly unimpressed by nearly everything she encountered on our station during the first 2 days of the visit. While the adult members of the delegation attended formal briefings and observed our research galleries with appropriate respect, Nora wandered slightly ahead of the group at every stop, hands in her pockets, studying things with the focused and mildly impatient expression of someone who was always 3 steps ahead of wherever she was supposed to be looking. I was assigned to escort the delegation through the lower research levels on the 3rd day, which included a short and carefully controlled observation of the Kelvaran array vault. It was a routine stop on the tour for visiting dignitaries, impressive in the way that a very large, very old, very mysterious thing is always impressive, and completely safe so long as nobody touched anything. I had given this part of the tour many times. I was not concerned. I began my standard explanation as the group gathered outside the reinforced observation window, the array visible through the glass in its usual state, dark, still, faintly luminous at its core the way it always was, like a banked fire that had never quite gone out in 5,000 years. I told them how it was found. I told them how long it had been studied. I told them, without particular emotion, that my civilization's best scientific minds across 160 generations had been unable to unlock it. Most visiting delegations responded to that last part with polite admiration, the respectful kind of silence people use when they are looking at something ancient and significant and want to seem appropriately moved by it. Nora said, clearly and without any particular ceremony, that it sounded like everyone had been solving the wrong problem. The two other human diplomats glanced at her. George Callum closed his eyes briefly, in the way a parent does when their child says something true at an inconvenient moment. My junior colleague standing beside me made a small sound that I think was meant to be diplomatic agreement, but came out sounding slightly strangled. I asked her, with measured patience, to explain what she meant. She pointed at the array through the glass and said that everything I had described sounded like thousands of years of people trying to give it what they thought it wanted, based on what they already believed about it. She said that was not solving a problem. That was guessing politely at an answer and being surprised when the answer kept saying no. I told her, perhaps a bit more stiffly than necessary, that the approaches used over 5,000 years were not guesses. They were the products of the most rigorous scientific methodology my civilization had ever developed. She nodded and said that was exactly what she meant. Nobody in the corridor said anything for a moment. I remember the hum of the environmental systems, the faint glow of the array through the glass, and the quiet, slightly dangerous feeling of a question hanging in the air that I did not have a clean answer for. I did not know it yet, but that question was about to pull 5,000 years of careful Voss certainty apart at the seams. We moved on from the vault shortly after, continuing the tour through the upper observation levels. I tried to set the conversation aside, the way I set aside most interruptions to my routine, efficiently and without sentimentality, but her words followed me through the rest of that afternoon, nudging at the edges of my concentration, the way a small sound in a quiet room demands more attention than its size deserves. What did she mean by solving the wrong problem? Every approach the Voss had applied to the array over 5,000 years had been based on observation, logic, and the most advanced theoretical frameworks our civilization possessed. We had not been guessing, we had been methodical, careful, exhaustively precise. If there was a flaw in 5,000 years of disciplined scientific work, it was certainly not that we had failed to think hard enough about it. And yet, when I returned to my quarters that evening and pulled up the complete historical archive of array interaction attempts, something I had done hundreds of times before, I found myself reading it differently than I ever had, not looking for patterns in the data, but looking for patterns in the approach. The way my people had always approached it, the assumptions built into every attempt before the first equation was ever written. Every single attempt, across 5,000 years and more theories than I could count, shared one quality so fundamental that no researcher had ever thought to name it. Every attempt had been designed to succeed on the first try. We built our solutions carefully, refined them completely, and then applied them in their finished form, because in Voss scientific culture, presenting an incomplete or experimental approach was considered the equivalent of admitting you had not done the work properly. We did not try things to see what happened. We tried things because we were certain they would work. I sat in the quiet of my quarters for a long time after realizing that. In the morning, I made a decision that felt professionally uncomfortable and personally necessary. I found George Callum at breakfast and asked, as casually as I could manage, whether his daughter might be willing to spend some time in informal conversation with me about research methodology. He looked at me for a moment, with the careful expression of a man who had learned to read situations quickly, then said he thought Nora would enjoy that very much, and asked whether there was something specific I was hoping to understand. I told him I was not sure yet, which was the most honest thing I had said to anyone in a very long time. Nora arrived at my office 20 minutes later, sat down in the chair across from my desk without waiting to be invited to sit, and asked me what I actually wanted to know. Not what I planned to ask, what I actually wanted to know. I told her I wanted to understand how she had arrived so quickly at the idea that we had been solving the wrong problem, when the people who had spent their entire lives studying the array had never considered it. She thought about that for a moment, then said it was because she had not spent her entire life studying it. She had only heard about it for the first time the day before. She said that when you do not know anything about something, you cannot be wrong about it yet, and that is actually a useful position to be in, because you are not protecting any ideas. You are just looking. I asked her what she had seen when she looked. She said she had seen a very old thing that nobody had managed to open, and a very long list of attempts that all had one thing in common: they were all trying to be right. She said in her experience, when something would not open no matter how carefully you tried to open it the right way, the answer was usually hiding somewhere in all the ways you had already decided were wrong. That was the moment I first began to truly understand what the next few days were going to mean. Not just for the array. Not just for me. For everything my civilization thought it knew about the difference between intelligence and understanding. The meeting I requested with our station director the following morning was the most uncomfortable conversation I had in years, and I have sat through committee reviews that lasted 4 days. Director Orath Ben was a precise, careful woman who had given 40 years of her life to array research and had the kind of permanent seriousness that comes from spending decades studying something that refuses to cooperate. She listened to my proposal without interrupting, which in our culture usually means the person listening is either genuinely interested or preparing a very thorough refusal. My proposal was simple in concept and deeply unusual in practice. I wanted to allow the human girl, Nora Callum, supervised access to the outer interaction console of the Kelvaran array, with no predetermined approach, no required methodology, and no expectation of a specific result. I wanted to observe what happened when someone who carried none of our 5,000 years of assumptions simply tried things to see what they did. Director Ben was quiet for a long time after I finished speaking. Then she said she had 2 questions. The first was whether I had lost my professional judgment. The second was whether I could have the necessary safety protocols in place by the following morning. I told her I believed my judgment was more intact than it had been in years, and that yes, I could have the protocols ready. She approved the request with one condition. She would be present in the observation room herself, personally, for the entire duration. I agreed without hesitation. I think some part of me was relieved. Whatever was about to happen, I did not want to be the only Voss scientist in the room when it did. Nora, when I told her what I had arranged, did not seem particularly amazed by the opportunity. She asked a few practical questions about what she would be allowed to touch, how the controls were laid out, and whether there was any real risk of anything dangerous happening if she did something unexpected. I told her the outer console controlled only surface-level resonance inputs, fully isolated from the array's core systems, and that the worst realistic outcome was the same quiet non-response we had observed for 5,000 years. She nodded and said that sounded fine, and asked if she could bring something to eat because she tended to think better when she was not hungry. I told her I would arrange it. Looking back now, that small practical request tells you almost everything you need to know about the difference between how humans approach a problem and how we do. We had treated the array like a sacred object for 5,000 years, approaching it with ceremony and reverence and the full solemn weight of our civilization's pride. Nora wanted a snack and a look at the controls, and she was the one who opened it. The morning Nora Callum sat down at the outer console of the Kelvaran array. The vault was more crowded than it had been in decades. Director Ben stood at the observation window above, flanked by two of our most senior engineers. My colleague Paris Ondath, who had spent 30 years on array containment theory and had published more papers on the subject than any living researcher, stood at the monitoring station beside me, with his hands very still and his face carrying the expression of a man who was not sure whether he was watching history or a waste of time. 3 other researchers stood near the back of the room, officially present to monitor safety readings, unofficially present because word had spread through the station the previous evening that something unusual was being attempted, and even the most disciplined Voss scientist is still curious at the end of the day. Nora sat in front of the console the way she sat in most chairs, slightly forward, elbows on the surface, completely relaxed in a way that had nothing to do with confidence, and everything to do with the fact that she simply did not carry the same weight of expectation that everyone else in that room had been carrying for most of their adult lives. She spent the first several minutes just looking, not reading the control labels, not studying the layout the way a trained researcher would, but simply looking, the way you look at something unfamiliar when you are trying to understand its shape before you understand its function. I stood beside her and said nothing, because she had asked me, the evening before, not to explain what the controls did unless she specifically asked. She said she wanted to see what she noticed without being told what she was supposed to notice. That alone was unlike anything any Voss researcher had ever done at that console. We always arrived with a framework. We always knew, before we touched anything, exactly what we were trying to accomplish. The idea of approaching the array without an intended outcome would have been considered almost professionally irresponsible in our culture. Purposeful study required purpose. That was not an opinion. It was a principle so deeply embedded in Voss scientific practice that most researchers had never consciously thought about it at all. Nora reached out and pressed the leftmost input key on the outer row. Nothing happened. She pressed the one beside it. Still nothing. She pressed a third, then circled back to the first, then pressed 2 at once. I watched Paris Ondath write something in his notes that I suspected was not flattering. Director Ben above us remained perfectly still. Then Nora did something that made everyone in the room pay a different kind of attention. She pressed the 4th key, held it, pressed the 7th, simultaneously, released the 4th while holding the 7th, and tapped the 2nd key 3 times in quick, uneven succession. The console hummed. It was a tiny sound, barely audible above the environmental systems. But in 5,000 years of recorded interaction attempts, the outer console of the Kelvaran array had never made that sound. Not once. Not from any input any Voss researcher had ever applied. Paris Ondath stopped writing. The researchers at the back of the room leaned forward simultaneously. I became very aware of my own breathing. Nora tilted her head slightly, the way someone tilts their head when they hear something faint and are trying to hear it better. She pressed the same irregular sequence again, this time slightly faster, with a shorter pause between the 7th key and the 2nd. The hum came back, fractionally louder. She said, without looking up, that it was responding to rhythm, not to which keys she pressed. I told her, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, that no interaction model in 5,000 years of array research had ever proposed a rhythmic input structure. Every theory was based on harmonic frequency, geometric sequencing, or mathematical relationships between input values. Nobody had considered something as seemingly simple as timing patterns, because the array's architecture showed no obvious mechanism for rhythm-based reception. She said maybe that was why nobody had ever gotten it to hum before. I could not argue with that. She worked for the next 40 minutes in a way I have never seen any researcher work before or since. There was no plan. There was no theory. There was not even a hypothesis in the formal sense. She simply followed each small response from the array, adjusting her next input based on what the previous one had done, building something out of accumulated reaction that no framework, no equation, and no 5,000 years of careful preparation had ever managed to construct. The hum grew, slowly, unevenly, in the organic and unpredictable way that something growing naturally is always uneven. It deepened and expanded until it was no longer just audible, but physically present, a vibration that moved through the floor of the vault and into the soles of our feet. Then the outer ring of the array moved. I have written and rewritten my account of that moment many times, and I still find it difficult to describe in a way that captures what it actually felt like to see it happen. The outer ring, a structure of dense ancient material that had not shifted position in 41 centuries of continuous study, rotated approximately 12 degrees clockwise and locked into a new position with a sound like something heavy and patient deciding, finally, that it was ready. The containment grid screamed its gold alarm into every corner of the vault. Every researcher in the room moved at once, hands going to instruments, voices rising in a rapid exchange of readings and confirmations and questions that had no answers yet, because nothing like this had ever happened before, and nothing in our training had prepared us for the possibility that it actually could. Nora sat very still in front of the console, watching the outer ring with calm, focused attention. She asked me, quietly enough that only I could hear her over the noise, whether what just happened was supposed to happen. I told her that in 5,000 years we had never come close enough to this moment to know what was supposed to happen next. She nodded slowly, as if that was a reasonable answer, and said she thought the ring had moved because the rhythm had given it a reference point, something to synchronize to that was not a fixed value but a repeating pattern with variation in it, like a heartbeat rather than a flat signal. She said she thought the people who built the array had expected the person trying to open it to be alive in the way they were communicating with it, not mechanical or mathematical, but genuinely responsive, adjusting in real time the way living things adjust to each other. I stood beside her in the noise and the light and the vibrating floor of a vault that had not felt alive in 5,000 years, and I understood, with a clarity that arrived quietly in the middle of all that chaos, that she was not just describing what had happened. She was describing exactly what my civilization had never once thought to offer the array in 5 centuries of trying. Director Ben's voice came through the internal comm, low and steady, cutting through the noise of the alarm. She asked for a containment status update. I pulled the readings and found something I had never expected to read. Containment was not failing. It was stabilizing, reorganizing itself around the array's new configuration, the way a system reorganizes when something that was previously wrong suddenly becomes right. Energy levels inside the core were rising, but not the way they rose during the dangerous, unstable spikes our models predicted for an improperly managed interaction. They were rising cleanly, purposefully, the way a system rises when it is finally receiving input it recognizes. Paris Ondath appeared beside me, his face the color of someone who had just watched their entire career's foundational assumptions dissolve in under an hour. He looked at my readings, looked at the array, looked at Nora, and said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, quietly, that in 30 years of work on containment theory, he had calculated the probability of an unstructured, improvised interaction producing a stable core response as something indistinguishably close to zero. I told him he might want to update that calculation. He said he was already working on it. The outer ring had stabilized in its new position. The gold alarms had shifted to a lower, steadier pulse, no longer frantic but persistent, the sound of a system that had changed states and was waiting to understand what came next. The central core of the array, visible through the inner observation port, was brighter than any reading in our historical archive had ever recorded for a live interaction. Nora leaned back slightly from the console, studying the core through the port with the focused, unhurried attention she brought to everything. Then she said that she thought there were more rings, and that each one probably needed something slightly different, a variation on the rhythm rather than a repetition of it, because repetition without change was just noise, and she did not think the people who built this would have wanted noise. I asked her how she intended to find what each ring needed. She said the same way she found what the first one needed. She would try things until something responded, and then she would follow the response. I remember looking around the vault at that moment, at Paris with his recalculated probability and his shaken expression, at the researchers near the back who had stopped pretending to take readings and were simply watching, at the steady pulse of the alarm and the bright core and the outer ring locked at 12 degrees of change from where it had sat for 41 centuries, and I remember thinking that this was the moment. Not the moment the array finally opened, because it had not finished opening yet. The moment I finally understood what had kept it closed. It had never been waiting for the right answer. It had been waiting for the right kind of mind. Not the most disciplined mind, not the most theoretically advanced mind, not the mind with the most carefully constructed approach. The mind willing to follow a response into territory it had never mapped, without knowing what it would find there, without needing to know before it went. In 5,000 years, not a single Voss scientist had walked into that vault willing to simply not know. We had always known exactly what we were trying. We had always understood, before we started, exactly what success was supposed to look like. That certainty, the certainty we had trained ourselves to carry as a point of pride, as the very foundation of what made Voss science, had been the closed door the entire time. The second ring moved 11 minutes later. Nora found its rhythm faster than the first, building on what the first ring had told her about the array's language. The sound it made when it shifted was different, lower, more resonant, like something large settling into a position it had been waiting a very long time to reach. The core brightened further. The floor vibration deepened. 3 of the researchers near the back of the room reached for the wall simultaneously, steadying themselves against something that felt less like vibration now and more like presence. Director Ben descended from the observation platform during the movement of the second ring, which told me more about the significance of what she was witnessing than anything she could have said aloud. In 40 years of array research, I had never once seen her leave the observation platform during an active session. She crossed the vault floor and stood beside me, watching Nora's hands move across the console, with the calm, relentless attentiveness of someone who had spent a lifetime looking for exactly this, and had taught herself not to hope for it anymore. She did not say anything. I did not say anything. Nora did not say anything either. She was too focused on the console to narrate what she was doing, which meant that for a long and extraordinary stretch of time, the only sounds in that vault were the deepening pulse of the alarm, the hum of the array's waking systems, and the quiet, irregular rhythm of a 16-year-old girl's hands doing something 5,000 years of the most advanced minds in our civilization's history had failed to do. The third ring moved. Then the fourth. Then the central column of the Kelvaran array, the compressed core of energy that our instruments had observed and measured and theorized about for 5,000 years without ever touching, released. There is no accurate word in Voss language for what happened when it released. The closest translation would be something like opened, but that word implies a door, and this was not a door. It was more like a held breath finally exhaled, or a tide finally turning, something with the quality of enormous and patient relief. Light poured from the core in a color our instruments had no established classification for, filling the vault from floor to ceiling in a warmth that every researcher present later described, in separate reports written independently of each other using the same word. Right. It felt right. Not exciting. Not overwhelming. Simply, deeply, unmistakably right. The alarm stopped. Not gradually, not winding down, but completely and immediately, as though they had finished saying what they needed to say and saw no reason to continue. The vault was very quiet. Nora lifted her hands from the console and sat back in her chair. She looked at the fully open core of the array with an expression that was thoughtful and calm and just slightly tired, the expression of someone who had worked steadily at something and was now taking a moment to look at what the work had built. She said that she thought it was probably designed to be opened by someone young, not because young people were smarter, but because young people were more comfortable not knowing things yet, and that comfort was what the array had needed someone to bring to it all along. Director Ben stood very still beside me for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was quieter than I had ever heard from her, that in 40 years of research, she had never once considered that comfort with not knowing might be a scientific qualification. Nora said it was the only qualification that had ever mattered for this particular problem, and that she suspected that was the point. I looked at the open core of the Kelvaran array, bright and steady, and finally, after 5,000 years, answering. And I thought about all the minds that had stood in this vault before us, brilliant and careful and certain, carrying the full weight of everything they knew, and how that weight had been, in the end, the one thing standing between them and the answer they had given their lives to find. The chaos that followed the array's opening was, in the immediate hours, almost indistinguishable from crisis. Our emergency systems did not know how to classify a scenario in which the array behaved correctly, because every safety protocol we had was built around the assumption that any significant array event would be dangerous by definition. The monitoring systems flagged stable energy readings as anomalous. The containment systems attempted twice to initiate shutdown procedures for a containment field that did not need shutting down. 3 different automated reports filed themselves with the Council using language designed for emergency responses, causing the duty officer to contact the vault in considerable alarm before I could explain that nothing was wrong. Everything, in fact, was exactly right. That was simply a condition our systems had never been designed to handle. Within 2 hours, 14 additional senior researchers had arrived at the vault, some from offices on the station, others called in from a nearby relay post where several of our leading array theorists had been working on yet another iteration of the harmonic frequency model. They came in quickly and then stood in the open vault doorway for long seconds before entering, staring at the lit and open core with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something that looked, on the faces of people who had spent their careers being carefully unemotional about their work, uncomfortably close to grief. I understood the grief. It was not grief for the array, which had finally done what it was always meant to do. It was grief for the story my civilization had told itself for 5,000 years, the story in which patience and rigor and perfect disciplined methodology would eventually unlock every secret the universe had placed in front of us. That story had just ended, not with a triumph for Voss science, but with a 16-year-old visitor from a species we had barely met, tapping an irregular rhythm on a surface console because nobody had thought to try that before. Paris Ondath spent the first hour after the opening running verification sequences on every reading the vault's instruments had produced, methodically and repeatedly, looking for an error that would let him understand the outcome without having to revise everything he thought he knew. He did not find one. He came to me eventually, holding a printed sheet of verified data the way you hold something you are not sure whether to keep, and said that in 30 years of containment research, he had built his entire professional identity around the belief that the array's resistance to interaction was a function of approach precision, and that a sufficiently precise approach, given enough development time, would eventually succeed. I asked him what he believed now. He said he was still working that out, and that he suspected it was going to take considerably longer than the array had. The Council convened an emergency session that afternoon. I was asked to provide a first-hand account of events, which I did, as clearly and completely as I could, though I noticed that several council members listened to the part about Nora's unstructured, rhythm-based, entirely improvised approach, with the expression of people whose minds were actively resisting information they could not fit into an existing framework. One senior member, a theorist named Voss Erlen, who had published extensively on array interaction models, asked me 3 separate times whether I was certain there had been no undisclosed theoretical basis for what the human had done. He seemed genuinely unable to accept that the answer to 5,000 years of failure had required no theory at all. I told him the 3rd time he asked that I was completely certain, that I had been standing beside Nora for the entire session, and that her approach had consisted entirely of pressing keys to observe reactions and then adjusting her next input based on what she observed, with no predetermined framework, no mathematical basis, and no intended outcome beyond simple curiosity about what the array would do. He wrote something in his notes. I suspect it was not a summary of what I had said. George Callum found me in the corridor outside the council chamber after the session ended. He was a man who had clearly spent his career learning to stay calm in rooms where other people were not, and he had that careful stillness now, the kind that comes from knowing something significant has happened and not yet knowing what it means. He asked me honestly how serious this was, and whether there would be any difficulty for his daughter as a result of what she had done. I told him that to the best of my understanding, Nora had not done anything she had not been given explicit permission to do, and that any difficulty would be entirely the property of my civilization's scientific community as it came to terms with 5,000 years of misplaced certainty. He was quiet for a moment, then said that Nora had done something similar 2 years ago with a communications array back on their homeworld that a team of engineers had been unable to repair for 6 months. He said she had fixed it in an afternoon by ignoring the repair manual and simply trying inputs until something responded. He said the engineers had been quietly furious about it for weeks afterward. I said I imagined they had. He said the thing about Nora was that she never actually understood why other people found that upsetting. To her, the most sensible thing to do with something that did not work was to try things until it did, and the idea that there was a correct procedure to follow before you were allowed to try things struck her as backwards, because you could not know which procedure was correct for a problem nobody had solved yet. I thought about that for the rest of the day. I am still thinking about it now. Within a week of the array's opening, we had completed enough preliminary analysis of the released energy to understand that our theories about it functioning as a gateway had been essentially correct, but fundamentally incomplete. The array was not simply a door to somewhere else. It was a calibration point, a node in a larger network of similar structures spread across a vast region of space, all of them linked through the same energy system, all of them presumably still sealed, waiting for the same kind of interaction that had opened ours. There were, by our initial estimates, somewhere between 40 and 60 of them. Our council met again to discuss implications. The conversation was lengthy, careful, and at several points heated, in the precise, controlled way that Voss disagreements are heated, which is to say that voices remained level while the content of what was said became increasingly direct. Some members wanted to immediately begin developing a formalized methodology based on Nora's approach, something that could be taught, replicated, and applied to the other array nodes by trained Voss researchers. Others argued that formalizing an approach that worked precisely because it was not formalized was a fundamental contradiction that would produce the same result as every other formal approach we had tried for 5,000 years. That argument went on for several sessions. As far as I know, it is still going on in some form. What the council agreed on unanimously, and quickly, was this: the other array nodes needed to be investigated, and the being who had demonstrated the most effective approach to array interaction currently on record was a 16-year-old human who was scheduled to return to her homeworld in 11 days. George Callum was approached by Director Ben personally, which was noted by everyone involved as a significant departure from how we normally handled formal requests. The proposal was straightforward: an invitation, fully voluntary and fully compensated, for Nora to join an extended research collaboration with our institute, with freedom to work on her own terms, no required methodology, no performance expectations, and no pressure to produce a result on any particular timeline. We wanted, as plainly as Director Ben put it, to understand how she thought, because how she thought had done in 40 minutes what our best minds had failed to do in 5,000 years. George Callum said he would ask Nora. Nora said yes, but she wanted her own workspace. She did not want people watching over her shoulder while she worked, and she wanted to know if the station had any decent food, because the cafeteria on level 3 was, in her honest opinion, extremely disappointing. Director Ben authorized all 3 requests without hesitation. I visited Nora 2 days later in the workspace we had arranged for her, a quiet room off the secondary research corridor with a clear view of the array vault through the outer observation window. She was sitting on the floor rather than in the chair, which I had learned was simply something she did when she was thinking, and she was looking at a diagram of the array's internal structure that Paris Ondath had prepared for her with information she had requested. She asked me to sit down, which I did, somewhat awkwardly, on the floor beside her. She said she had been thinking about the other array nodes and whether they would all need the same kind of rhythmic approach or whether each one might need something slightly different, not because they were different machines, but because the people who built them might have expected each one to be opened by someone with a different kind of natural thinking, and that the network as a whole might have been designed to require a variety of minds rather than a single correct method applied repeatedly. I said that was a significant theoretical proposition that would take considerable time and research to evaluate properly. She said she was not proposing a theory, she was just thinking out loud and wanted to know what I thought. I told her I thought she was probably right, and that the implications of being right about that were large enough that most of my colleagues were going to spend the next few years being deeply uncomfortable about it. She smiled, briefly, and said that was usually how it went when someone found a simpler answer than everyone expected. I looked at the array through the observation window, its core still lit and steady and open after 5,000 years of silence, and I thought about the word she had just used. Simpler, not easier, not luckier, simpler, because the answer had always been simple. The array had never asked for perfection. It had asked for presence, for the willingness to show up without a finished answer and follow a conversation into the unknown without knowing where it led. We had spent 5,000 years giving it everything except that. The following months brought changes to our institute that I would not have predicted even on the morning Nora first walked through our vault doors. Several long-running research projects that had been locked in theoretical development for decades, never tested because no formalized model was considered complete enough to justify direct interaction, were quietly restructured to allow early, exploratory contact. Not chaotic, not undisciplined, but adaptive in a way that our methods had never previously allowed for. Some of those projects produced more meaningful data in the first 2 months of their new approach than they had in the previous 10 years. Paris Ondath published a paper arguing that the array's resistance to structured interaction was not a design feature but a design language, and that the precursor civilization had built their technology to communicate through exchange rather than input, requiring the interacting party to listen as much as to speak. The paper was debated extensively. Several senior researchers disputed its core premise vigorously. A number of younger researchers read it and immediately began approaching their own work differently. That, too, was new. Nora stayed at the institute for 4 months, before returning home for the beginning of her school term, which she had apparently been less concerned about missing than her father had. In those 4 months, she interacted with 3 additional sealed array-linked structures stored in our artifact repository, 2 of which responded to her in ways they had not responded to in recorded study. The third responded to a different rhythm than the array had used. One she said felt angrier somehow, more impatient, which was not a description any Voss researcher had ever applied to a precursor artifact before, but which the data, when we looked at it honestly, did not entirely contradict. Before she left, I asked her the question I had been carrying since the morning the outer ring of the array first moved. I asked whether she had ever been afraid, sitting at that console, that she might do something wrong. She thought about it for a long moment. Then she said she had not been afraid of doing something wrong, because the whole point was that she did not know what wrong looked like yet, and you could not be afraid of something you had not defined. She said she had been slightly nervous about doing something irreversible in a bad way, but since she had been told the outer console was isolated from the core, she trusted that the worst realistic outcome was just nothing happening at all. She said nothing happening was the one outcome she was genuinely not afraid of, because she had already seen 5,000 years of nothing happening, and at least trying something new was more interesting than that. I have thought about those words more than almost anything else she said during her time with us. Not because they were complicated, but because they were so completely straightforward that the fact my civilization had never arrived at them on its own said something I am still learning to sit with. We built everything we are on the belief that careful knowledge was the only safe foundation for action. We were not wrong about that, not entirely. Knowledge matters. Preparation matters. The rigorous, patient, disciplined study that has defined our civilization for thousands of years has produced things that genuinely deserve to be proud of. I do not believe Nora Callum's way of thinking should simply replace what we are. I believe it should stand beside it, not as a correction to Voss science, but as the thing Voss science had been missing without knowing it had a name. The willingness to try the answer that might be wrong, quietly, honestly, without ceremony, without protecting a framework you spent years building, and without needing to know the outcome before you begin. The Council has since approved the first formal human-Voss joint research partnership in our Institute's history, a collaborative team tasked with investigating 3 of the most intact unresponsive precursor sites in our explored territory. 2 Voss senior researchers, 1 human theorist named Daniel Price who spent 20 years studying language evolution, and 1 human field researcher named Maggie Trent, who has a reputation among her own colleagues for solving things nobody else can explain. And 1 standing invitation, open indefinitely, for a young woman named Nora Callum to join any session she finds interesting, on her own schedule, on her own terms, whenever she happens to be available. She accepted the standing invitation by sending a very short message that said she was looking forward to it, and asked whether we had fixed the cafeteria on level 3 yet. We had. That too had taken 5,000 years and a human to finally prompt us to address. I am writing these words in the vault, sitting where I always sit during late sessions, with the open core of the array visible through the inner port, steady and warm and finally, after an almost incomprehensible span of patient waiting, at rest. I think about what it was waiting for, across all those centuries of careful, brilliant, determined Voss minds coming and going and trying and failing. I think about what it must have looked like from the inside of that ancient structure, generation after generation of the same disciplined approach, the same beautiful, elegant attempts, the same confident certainty, arriving and failing and arriving again. I wonder if it was patient because it was designed to be, or because it understood that eventually the right kind of mind would arrive. Not the smartest, not the most prepared, just the one honest enough to say it did not know, and curious enough to find that not knowing was an invitation rather than a barrier. The universe, I have come to believe, is less interested in the answers we carry into it than in the questions we are willing to follow when we get there. My civilization spent 5,000 years being too certain to follow a question into unknown space. A human teenager with scuffed boots and a healthy skepticism about authority had no such limitation. I do not know what the other array nodes hold. I do not know what the full network, once opened, will reveal about the civilization that built it, or what understanding their technology will mean for the species that come after us. I do not know whether the lessons we have begun, cautiously and with considerable ongoing debate, to learn from this experience will change Voss science in ways that last, or whether old habits will eventually pull us back toward the safety of the answers we already have. What I know is this: the array is open, the core is lit. The silence that gave it its name is over, and the reason it is over has nothing to do with 5,000 years of effort, and everything to do with a single afternoon of honest, unhurried, fearless not knowing. I find, sitting here in the warmth of its light, that I am not as unsettled by that as I expected to be. I find instead that I am grateful for it, grateful for the discomfort of it, grateful for the question that does not have a tidy answer, the one that Nora Callum dropped into a quiet corridor outside this vault and walked away from without seeming to understand how deep it would reach. Why did we assume the puzzle wanted an elegant answer? We are still finding out. I suspect we will be finding out for a very long time. And for the first time in my 62 years of careful, disciplined, methodical Voss research, I am genuinely glad that the answer is not yet finished. The not knowing, it turns out, was never the obstacle. It was always the door,